The night was ordinary, or at least it started that way. The smell of freshly cooked food drifted through the small, dimly lit kitchen, a place that had seen more arguments than laughter, more silence than warmth. I remember sitting at the table, my plate in front of me, my stomach quietly growling from the long day. I had been waiting for this dinner, not just because I was hungry, but because it was one of those rare moments where everyone was in the same room. My mother moved around the kitchen with a certain sharpness in her movements. Every sound, the clattering of utensils, the slamming of drawers, carried a weight, a tension that filled the air before words even did. She placed the food on the table, not gently but as if she was tired of doing it, as if feeding us was a burden rather than love. I reached for my plate, trying to stay quiet, trying not to trigger whatever storm was brewing behind her expression. But then she looked at me, really looked, with that same mix of irritation and disgust I had grown used to over the years. It wasn't just anger in her eyes, it was something colder, a kind of disappointment that made me feel like I was nothing more than an inconvenience in her life. I don't remember what sparked it. Maybe I said something too softly, or maybe I didn't say anything at all. Maybe my silence annoyed her, or maybe she needed someone to blame for a bad day. Whatever it was, it didn't take long before her voice rose, slicing through the fragile peace of the evening. She began scolding me, saying things that burned more than the food on my plate ever could. Her words hit harder than her hand ever did, words about how ungrateful I was, how I would never become anything, how I should be thankful that she even bothered to feed me. I sat there, staring at my food, each word cutting a little deeper into my chest. And then it happened. The moment I'll never forget. She reached across the table, her hand swift and cruel, and with a sharp flick, she knocked my plate to the ground. The crash echoed in the small kitchen, food scattering across the floor like pieces of my pride. For a second, everything went silent, no words, no movement, just the sound of my heartbeat in my ears. I looked at the mess on the floor, the dinner I had been waiting for, now ruined. My eyes started to sting, but I bit my lip, refusing to cry. I thought maybe she'd stop, maybe she'd realize what she'd done. But instead, she looked at me, smirking, and said the words that would stay with me forever: "If you want dinner, lick it off the floor." The words hit me like a slap I couldn't dodge. My throat went dry, my chest tightened, and the room felt suddenly smaller, heavier. I didn't move. I couldn't. Every ounce of strength I had was holding back the tears, the anger, the shame that rushed through me all at once. She turned away, as if it meant nothing, as if degrading her own child was an act of discipline rather than cruelty. I could feel the heat of humiliation crawling up my neck, the sting of her laughter filling my ears. That moment lasted longer than it should have. Seconds felt like minutes, minutes like hours. I remember glancing down at the food on the floor, the bits of rice and vegetables scattered around like symbols of everything I didn't have: respect, love, security. I wanted to scream, to yell, to throw the plate back, to ask her why. But the words wouldn't come out. I just sat there, frozen in the kind of pain that doesn't need bruises to hurt. The humiliation wasn't just about the food. It was about the years of feeling invisible, of being told I was worthless, of never being enough no matter how hard I tried. That night wasn't the first time she had said something cruel, but it was the first time I truly realized how little I meant to her. It wasn't about dinner, it was about power. She wanted to remind me that I had none. She wanted to make sure I knew my place, low and silent, beneath her authority. But something shifted inside me as I stared at that floor. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just a quiet spark, a mix of anger and awakening. For the first time, I felt something new rising beneath the humiliation, something that wasn't pain. It was defiance, the faint beginning of a voice that had been silenced for too long. I didn't speak that night, I didn't fight back, but inside, a promise was forming, a promise that one day, I would never be in that position again. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I cleaned the mess in silence, my hands trembling as I picked up the pieces, careful not to make another mistake, careful not to make more noise. Each crumb I picked up felt like another piece of my dignity being scraped off the floor, but I did it anyway. Because what else could I do? I had nowhere to go, no one to turn to, and no voice strong enough to defend myself yet. I could feel her eyes on me as I worked, that same cold stare that made me shrink smaller inside myself. I wanted to disappear, but deep down I knew that one day I wouldn't have to. When I was done, I went to bed without eating. My stomach was empty, but my heart was full of something I couldn't name at the time, something that would grow, slowly, over the years. As I lay there staring at the ceiling, I kept hearing her words, echoing over and over. If you want dinner, lick it off the floor. Each repetition hurt less and burned more, until it became less of a wound and more of a memory etched into me, one that I knew would follow me forever. That night became the point where everything inside me began to crack. Until then, I had tried to convince myself that her words didn't matter, that maybe she was just angry, stressed, or tired. I kept finding reasons to forgive her because I wanted to believe that somewhere under all that cruelty, there was still a trace of the mother I needed. But after that dinner, something changed. I stopped trying to explain her behavior. The truth was too clear to ignore. She didn't see me as a person worth respect or kindness. The humiliation had stripped me of every illusion I had left. The following days felt heavier than usual. Every time I walked into the kitchen, I could still see the broken plate in my mind, still hear her voice mocking me. The air between us had shifted. It was colder now, sharper, and I knew I had crossed an invisible line. She didn't have to remind me again. I already knew my place in her eyes. I moved quietly around the house, speaking less, keeping my head down, trying to avoid confrontation. But the silence wasn't peace. It was suffocating, filled with the weight of unspoken pain and resentment. Every meal after that became a test. Sitting at the table, I could feel her eyes on me, watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. Sometimes I felt her smirk, as if she remembered exactly what she'd said that night and took pride in it. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. My pride was broken, but something inside me refused to let her see my weakness. I would chew my food slowly, swallow quietly, and pretend everything was fine while my chest burned with the memory. It wasn't just about the plate anymore. It became a symbol of how fragile my self-worth was, how easily it could be shattered with a few cruel words and a flick of her hand. I started to see patterns I hadn't noticed before, the constant belittling, the manipulation, the emotional whiplash that left me confused about whether I was loved or merely tolerated. I had spent years trying to earn her approval, chasing a version of love that always came with conditions. But that night proved what I had been afraid to admit. No matter what I did, it would never be enough. I began to withdraw from people around me, even friends who asked if everything was okay. I didn't know how to explain what was happening at home. How could I? It sounded too cruel to be real. Parents were supposed to protect their children, not humiliate them. Mothers were supposed to nurture, not destroy. I thought maybe I was the problem, maybe I deserved it somehow. That's the thing about emotional abuse. It twists your sense of reality until you start believing you are the cause of your own suffering. At night, I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over. The sound of the plate hitting the floor became a constant echo in my head. I could feel my throat tighten every time I thought about it. I started to notice how small I had become, not just in her presence, but in my own life. I no longer spoke up, no longer expressed opinions, no longer dreamed the way I used to. I lived in survival mode, careful, cautious, afraid of stepping on invisible landmines that could explode at any moment. But in that silence, I also began to notice something else. Beneath all the fear and shame, a small part of me was getting tired of feeling powerless, tired of being humiliated, tired of pretending I was fine. The breaking point wasn't just about the plate, it was about everything that came before it, every insult, every dismissal, every look that made me feel like I didn't belong in my own home. That single moment simply forced me to see it all at once. The pain became a strange sort of clarity. It was as if the illusion had finally shattered, and I could see my life for what it was, a constant effort to please someone who would never be pleased. I realized that if I kept waiting for her approval, I would spend my entire life crawling for crumbs of affection that were never coming. That thought hurt more than anything else, but it was also the truth that began to set me free, even if I didn't understand it then. Each morning after that night felt different. The air felt heavier, but my thoughts were sharper. I noticed her moods, her patterns, the way she used guilt as a weapon. I started predicting her reactions, not because I wanted to please her, but because I was preparing myself. It was no longer about surviving her words, it was about building a wall against them. I began to see the cruelty not as a reflection of me, but as a reflection of her bitterness, her own pain, her need to control something, even if it was her own child. Still, that realization didn't make the pain go away. There were moments when I wanted to scream, to ask her why she hated me so much, why she needed to tear me down to feel powerful. But I knew she wouldn't answer. She would only laugh, like she always did, dismissing my pain as weakness. That became the hardest part, carrying so much hurt in silence, knowing there would be no apology, no understanding, no closure. I remember one evening when she called me to dinner again. The table was set the same way as before, but I couldn't bring myself to sit. My hands trembled slightly as I stood there, remembering how quickly things could turn. She looked at me with that same cold stare, as if daring me to say something, but I didn't. I simply looked at the chair, then at the floor, and walked away. That small act, barely noticeable to anyone else, was the first time I refused to play her game. It didn't feel like victory, not yet, but it felt like the first breath after being underwater too long. That moment was when the breaking point turned into awareness. I had spent so much of my life trying to fix her, trying to be the reason she changed, but now I understood that I couldn't. The only thing I could control was myself, my reaction, my future. The wound she caused was deep, but it wasn't going to define me forever. It would take time, strength, and distance, but I could already feel the faint beginning of something forming inside me, not forgiveness, not yet, but a kind of resolve that I had never known before. The humiliation that night stayed with me like a shadow I couldn't shake off. For days, it haunted my thoughts, replaying in my mind every time I tried to eat, every time I passed the kitchen, every time I caught my reflection and saw the same defeated look in my eyes. But somewhere in the middle of all that shame, something unexpected began to grow. It wasn't anger at first, it was something quieter, something stubborn. It was the thought that maybe, just maybe, I didn't deserve to be treated like that. The idea was small, fragile, but it refused to die, no matter how many times her words tried to crush it. I started to notice how often I had accepted things that hurt me, how easily I apologized for things I didn't do, how many times I swallowed my pride just to keep peace. I had spent my whole life trying to make her proud, trying to earn the affection that never came. But now, after that night, I couldn't bring myself to keep trying in the same way. Every time I remembered her laughing as she told me to lick the food off the floor, something inside me clenched not in fear, but in determination. If I couldn't have her respect, then I would learn to build my own. It started small. I began to stand up a little straighter, even if my heart still felt heavy. When she insulted me, I didn't react the same way. I didn't cry or explain myself anymore. I just listened, quiet and cold, until she ran out of things to say. I could tell it bothered her. She wasn't used to silence from me. For the first time, I wasn't feeding her power. And though I still felt weak most days, those small acts of resistance started to strengthen something deep inside me. The more I thought about that night, the more I realized that pain could either destroy you or push you forward. I didn't have control over what she did, but I had control over what I did next. I couldn't erase her words, but I could change the meaning they had in my life. I began to think of them not as an insult, but as a challenge. Every cruel thing she said became another reason for me to prove her wrong. If she said I would never amount to anything, I decided I would become something. If she said I was weak, I would find strength in places she could never see. I started focusing more on school, on work, on anything that could pull me out of the house, out of that environment. Each small accomplishment felt like a victory she didn't know about, a secret rebellion against the person who wanted to keep me small. I studied harder, stayed up later, and spent my free time imagining a life where I didn't have to look over my shoulder or flinch at someone's tone. Every time I thought of giving up, I remembered that plate, shattered and scattered on the floor, and it reminded me why I couldn't stop. There were still moments when the pain hit me unexpectedly. Sometimes I would be walking home or eating alone and suddenly hear her voice in my head, cruel and mocking. But instead of letting it break me, I began to use it. Her voice became the fire that pushed me to keep going. Every insult was like fuel, and I was learning how to turn it into energy. The more she tried to make me feel worthless, the harder I worked to prove to myself, not to her, that I wasn't. It wasn't easy. There were days when the weight of everything felt unbearable, when the old doubts crept back in, whispering that I would never escape, that I was fooling myself by thinking I could be different. But then I would remember the way she looked at me that night, the satisfaction in her eyes when she saw me broken, and that memory alone was enough to reignite the spark. I refused to let her win by staying small. I refused to let her laughter be the final sound in my story. The more I pushed forward, the more I began to understand that revenge wasn't always loud. It didn't have to come in the form of confrontation or cruelty. Sometimes the most powerful revenge was transformation, becoming everything they said you couldn't be. My anger started to shift into focus. I stopped dreaming about shouting back or making her regret it. Instead, I dreamed about freedom, independence, success. I wanted to build a life so strong that her words couldn't reach it, a life that proved she was wrong without me ever having to say a word. Every insult became a step. Every memory of humiliation became a reason to move. I began saving small amounts of money from part-time jobs, planning for a day when I could finally leave that house. The thought of escape became my motivation. I started setting goals, things that once felt impossible but now felt necessary. Each plan, each step, each little victory became part of the armor I was building. Even when she continued her insults, I no longer felt the same sting. I could hear her words, but they didn't sink in the way they used to. It was as if the part of me that once absorbed her cruelty had finally learned to shield itself. I began to see her differently too. The same woman who once terrified me now looked small, trapped in her own bitterness. Her words weren't power anymore, they were proof of her own unhappiness. And that realization, quiet but profound, gave me strength I didn't know I had. There were moments when I caught myself smiling, not because everything was okay, but because I knew I was changing. I was learning how to take control of my story, to stop living in the version of me she had created. The shame that once held me down had turned into a drive to rise. The floor she once told me to eat from had become a symbol of the foundation I was building. I wasn't just trying to survive anymore. I was starting to live with purpose, even if that purpose was born from pain. That's what turning shame into motivation looked like: quiet, steady, relentless. It wasn't a single decision or a dramatic moment of courage. It was 1,000 small choices made in silence, each one pulling me further from the person I had been that night. Each time I chose to work harder, to hold my head higher, to refuse to break, I was rewriting the story she tried to write for me. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It came slowly, almost invisibly, like dawn creeping into a dark room. After years of silence and endurance, I began to change in ways I didn't even notice at first. The pain that once consumed me started to become fuel, and the anger that used to burn uncontrollably turned into focus. I didn't tell anyone about what I was going through. I just carried it quietly, letting it shape me from the inside out. It was a silent journey, one that no one saw, but one that defined everything I became afterward. I started to find comfort in solitude. Being alone used to feel like punishment, but now it felt like peace. I realized that silence wasn't always empty. Sometimes it was the only space where I could hear myself think. I would spend hours sitting by the window, watching the world outside, imagining a life where I wasn't constantly walking on eggshells. In those moments, I would remind myself that I was more than what her words had made me believe. I began to see small glimpses of strength, hidden under layers of fear. It was there, waiting to be noticed, waiting to grow. At school or work, I spoke little, but I listened more. I watched how people treated each other, how kindness looked, how respect sounded. It was strange, realizing that what I had thought was normal, the shouting, the insults, the control, wasn't what love was supposed to look like. The more I observed others, the clearer it became that I had been surviving in an environment that had twisted my understanding of care. I started to teach myself what real empathy felt like by learning from others who carried it naturally. There were moments when the silence turned heavy again, when the memories returned unexpectedly and made it hard to breathe. Sometimes I would be washing dishes or walking down the street, and suddenly I would hear her voice, that same cruel tone echoing in my head, reminding me of all the things I wasn't. But instead of breaking down like before, I would pause, take a deep breath, and remind myself that her words didn't define me anymore. It became a kind of mental training, a battle between who I was taught to be and who I was becoming. I began to write in secret. Late at night, when the house was quiet, I would take out an old notebook and spill my thoughts onto paper. It became my therapy, my refuge. I wrote about anger, about pain, about dreams that still felt far away. I didn't write for anyone else. I wrote for myself, to understand what I was feeling, to make sense of everything that had happened. Those pages became witnesses to my silent transformation. With each word, I took back a little more control over my own story. As I grew older, I started to recognize the strength that had come from enduring so much. I realized that surviving cruelty had given me something she could never take away: resilience. Every insult, every humiliation had built layers of endurance around me, not to make me hard, but to make me steady. I learned how to stay calm in chaos, how to think clearly under pressure, how to keep moving even when everything felt impossible. What once felt like weakness had become my foundation. There were still days when I doubted myself. Healing wasn't a straight line. Some mornings I woke up feeling powerful, ready to take on the world. Other days I felt small again, like the same child sitting at that table with broken food on the floor. But even on those days, I didn't give up. I had learned that transformation wasn't about never falling, it was about refusing to stay down. I kept going, quietly, even when no one was watching, even when no one believed in me. I started setting boundaries, something I had never done before. When she yelled, I didn't react. When she insulted me, I didn't argue. I just left the room, choosing peace over conflict. It was strange at first, but with time, it started to feel natural. The more I removed myself from her chaos, the more I discovered who I was outside of her shadow. I realized that I didn't have to match her energy or seek her approval. I was free to define my worth in my own way. People around me began to notice the difference. Teachers, coworkers, friends, they would comment on how calm I was, how focused I seemed. They didn't know that my calmness came from years of walking through storms. They didn't know that my patience had been built from surviving endless shouting matches and silent treatments. Every quality that people admired in me was born from pain I had once wished would end. The irony wasn't lost on me. What was once my greatest weakness had quietly become my strength. There were moments of quiet pride that no one else could understand. Like the first time I bought something with money I earned myself, or the first time I stood up to someone and didn't shake afterward. Each small victory felt like a piece of my identity being rebuilt. I didn't need to announce it. The satisfaction was private, sacred. These moments reminded me that I was moving forward, step by step, no matter how slow it seemed. Sometimes, I would catch my reflection and barely recognize myself. Not because I looked different, but because I felt different. My eyes, once filled with fear, now carried something steadier, a quiet confidence. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. I had learned to measure my progress not by other people's approval, but by how I felt inside. The voice that used to tell me I wasn't good enough had grown weaker, replaced by one that whispered, "Keep going." The journey was never about revenge in the way people usually imagine it. It wasn't about hurting her back or making her suffer. It was about reclaiming myself, the version of me that had been buried under years of cruelty and silence. The more I focused on becoming better, the less I needed her acknowledgement. The pain that once chained me down was now the same force pushing me forward. Through all of this, I learned the power of quiet growth. Not every transformation needs an audience. Some of the most powerful changes happen in silence, behind closed doors, when no one believes in you but yourself. That was the kind of transformation I went through, invisible to others, but life-altering to me. It was the kind of growth that turned pain into patience, fear into focus, and silence into strength. Success didn't arrive with grand gestures or applause. It came slowly, built from sleepless nights, quiet effort, and a fire that had been lit long ago in that small, broken kitchen. I didn't even realize at first that I was succeeding. I was too focused on surviving, on building, on moving forward one small step at a time. But somewhere along the way, the tiny steps began to add up. The same hands that once picked food off the floor were now building a life no one could take from me. Each accomplishment felt like a quiet rebellion against everything she had ever told me. Every achievement whispered, without words, that she had been wrong. The world outside that house became my escape, and then my stage. The determination that was born out of pain began to transform into ambition. I started to excel at the things I once thought I couldn't do. I poured myself into work, studies, and every opportunity that came my way. I wasn't the smartest or the most talented, but I had something most others didn't: the memory of being told I was nothing. That memory was my engine. Every time I heard her voice echoing in my head, I worked harder. Every time doubt tried to creep in, I remembered that night and used it to push through. The world started to take notice. People who had never known my story began to see the results of years of quiet persistence. Compliments began to replace criticism. Encouragement replaced insults. It felt strange at first to be praised for things I had learned in pain. I would hear someone say, "You're so disciplined," or "You never give up," and all I could think of was how discipline was born out of fear, how persistence was my only way of survival. But still, I accepted those words, not as reminders of my past, but as proof that I had turned something dark into something worthwhile. There were times when success felt bittersweet. I would achieve something I had once dreamed of, and for a brief moment, I would wish she could see it. Not to seek her approval, but to show her that the same child she mocked had built something beautiful. But then I would stop myself. I didn't need her validation anymore. My success wasn't for her. It was for the version of me that had once been too scared to dream, too broken to believe. Each goal reached was a promise kept to that version of myself, a promise that I would never be humiliated again. The journey wasn't without struggle. Even as I moved forward, there were days when her words came back, whispering that I didn't belong, that I was still the same worthless person she saw. But I had learned how to fight back, not with anger, but with proof. Every success, every milestone, every small victory was an answer to those whispers. I no longer needed to argue with her memory. I had facts, results, a life that spoke for itself. People often say success is the best revenge, and maybe that's true. But for me, success wasn't about revenge, it was about redemption. It was about proving, not to her, but to myself, that I was never what she said I was. I found power in independence, in earning my own way, in knowing that everything I had was mine because I fought for it. Each paycheck, each project, each recognition felt like a quiet triumph over the years of being belittled. There were moments when I would pause and look back at how far I'd come. The person I used to be felt like a distant memory, fragile, afraid, uncertain. Now I stood taller, walked differently, spoke with more confidence. I had learned that self-respect was something you had to build from the ground up, especially when no one gave it to you. And that kind of strength doesn't fade easily. It stays rooted deep, reminding you of who you are even when life tries to shake you again. I found peace in routine, in hard work, in planning, in discipline. The same structure that once kept me small now became my foundation for growth. I set goals not out of desperation, but out of hunger for more. I wanted to keep evolving, to never stop proving to myself that I was capable of more than anyone expected. The victories didn't need to be loud. The quiet ones, the days I stayed consistent, the moments I chose peace over chaos, the nights I worked when no one was watching, those became my real wins. Every now and then, I would cross paths with people who reminded me of her, those who tried to belittle or control others to feel powerful. But instead of shrinking like before, I found myself unshaken. I no longer needed to prove myself to people like that. I had already learned that true power doesn't come from controlling others. It comes from controlling yourself, from rising above the noise and staying focused on your own path. I started to attract people who valued me, who respected my strength, who saw what I had built instead of where I came from. These new connections healed parts of me I didn't know were still broken. They reminded me that not everyone would tear you down, that there are people who build you up without expecting anything in return. Slowly, I began to trust again, to open up, to believe that kindness wasn't weakness. Sometimes, late at night, I would sit in silence and think about how different my life had become. The same silence that once suffocated me had turned into something peaceful. I had made it my own. Success had changed its meaning for me. It wasn't about money, fame, or recognition. It was about freedom. Freedom to eat when I wanted, to speak without fear, to live without shame. It was about never again feeling like I had to earn basic respect. That success, quiet and steady, became my armor. It didn't erase the past, but it gave it purpose. It turned pain into proof, weakness into wisdom, and humiliation into growth. Every time I accomplished something new, I thought of that night, the food on the floor, the laughter, the cruelty, and I realized how far I had come from it. The same moment that was meant to destroy me had instead become the foundation for everything I had built. The day came when life had come full circle, though not in the way I had imagined it would. I didn't plan for it, didn't chase it, but somehow, time has a way of arranging moments that reveal truths you once longed to show. Years had passed since that night when she knocked my plate to the floor. I had changed in ways she could never understand. My silence had turned into confidence, my fear into control. I no longer sought her approval. I no longer carried her voice as a burden. But life, with its strange sense of irony, gave me the chance to see what happens when the tables turn, when the one who mocked you is forced to face what they created. It happened on a quiet afternoon. She was older now, slower, her voice not as sharp as before. Time had softened her, or maybe it had simply taken away her energy to fight. I came to visit, not out of obligation, but because I wanted to see her as she was, not the towering figure who had once dominated my life, but as a person stripped of power. When I walked into that same kitchen where so much had once happened, I felt an old, familiar weight in my chest. The air still carried the memories, but they no longer hurt. They were just ghosts passing through. She was sitting at the table, her back slightly bent, her hands trembling as she tried to eat. The strong, commanding presence that used to fill every corner of that house had faded. For a moment, I stood there, watching her, and the image of that night flashed before me. The sound of the plate, the laughter, the words, all of it returned like a scene from a movie I once lived. Only this time, I wasn't the same character. I wasn't broken, scared, or desperate for her acceptance. I was calm, composed, untouchable. When she looked up at me, her eyes searched mine, as if trying to recognize the person standing before her. I could tell she saw the difference. The tone of her voice had changed. It lacked the authority it once carried. There was a hesitation now, a kind of quiet awareness that things were not the same. She tried to speak to me with that same familiar edge, but it didn't work anymore. Her words fell flat, powerless against the shield I had built over the years. There was a moment during that visit when her spoon slipped from her hand and clattered to the floor. It was such a simple, meaningless thing, but the sound echoed louder than it should have. For a second, time froze. I looked at the spoon lying on the floor, and memories collided: the plate, the food, her laughter, my shame. She looked up at me, waiting for me to react. Maybe she remembered too. Maybe she realized the cruel symmetry of it all. I didn't move immediately. I just looked at her, and for the first time, I saw her not as my mother, not as the person who hurt me, but as a reflection of her own consequences. I bent down, picked up the spoon, and placed it gently back on the table. She didn't say anything. Her eyes lowered, and for a moment, there was silence, not the heavy, suffocating silence of my childhood, but a different one. A silence that spoke of realization, of guilt, of time's quiet revenge. I didn't need to say a word. The message was already written in the moment. She began to speak about her health, about the struggles she was facing, about how life had become hard. I listened, not with bitterness, but with understanding. There was no satisfaction in her pain. I didn't want her to suffer. I only wanted her to see that the person she once broke had not only survived but thrived. Every word she spoke reminded me how much life changes when power shifts, how age humbles those who once believed they were untouchable. As she talked, I looked around the house, the faded walls, the chipped paint, the quiet emptiness. The same house that had once echoed with her anger now felt like a museum of memories, frozen in time. The power she once wielded here had vanished. And yet, sitting there, I didn't feel hate. I felt something far stronger: freedom. I had moved past needing to prove anything. I had already won, not through vengeance, but through transformation. At one point, she looked at me and said something simple, something she had never said before. She said she was proud of me. The words sounded foreign coming from her lips, almost awkward, but sincere. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to dismiss it, to remind her of all the things she'd said before, but another part of me just let it be. I didn't need her apology anymore. The closure had already come long before that day. In that kitchen, I realized that revenge doesn't always come in fire and fury. Sometimes it arrives quietly in the form of peace. The real revenge was that I had built a life she couldn't control, a life defined not by pain but by strength. I had made her eat her words, not through confrontation, but by becoming the opposite of what she expected. Every cruel thing she said had turned into a lesson, every insult into a motivation. She had unknowingly taught me how to endure, how to rise, how to lead. As the afternoon faded into evening, I got up to leave. She watched me walk out, her expression unreadable, part pride, part regret, part something unspoken. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The story had already been rewritten. She had spent years trying to make me feel small, and now she sat in the same room, seeing what I had become, someone she could no longer break, someone she could no longer mock. When I stepped outside, the air felt different, lighter. The sky was beginning to turn orange, the kind of color that only comes at the end of a long, exhausting day. I took a deep breath and realized that I no longer carried the weight of that house, that memory, or her words. The world around me was silent, but this time, the silence didn't hurt. It felt earned. It felt like victory wrapped in peace. It felt like the end of a story that had begun with humiliation and ended with dignity.